Have you ever had to swallow the pain of knocking on a child's door and being left outside? In today's video, you'll hear the story of Mercedes Rivas, a 72-year-old woman who always put others first, until the day she needed help and was rejected by her own family. But what no one imagined is that Mercedes carried something from the past. A silent gesture, forgotten even by her, yet powerful enough to change everything. This story is for anyone who's ever been underestimated, ignored, or treated as a burden, and wants to remember that dignity has no age. Would you have the courage to turn your back on the very person who once taught you to walk? Stay with me until the end, because sometimes the one who's been silenced the most is the one with the greatest power to decide. I was never the type to write about myself. I always thought it was more beautiful to talk about books, about the authors who marked my life, or about the childhood memories of the neighborhood where I grew up. But after what happened that day, a day that seemed ordinary yet turned everything upside down, I felt I needed to put it out. Not to seek pity, nor to hear advice, but to remind myself of who I am, of what I endured, and of what I finally stopped accepting in silence. I was 72 that cold June morning. The sky was the color of concrete, and the smell of damp crept through the window cracks as if to warn me of something. I woke early, as always, made my coffee with milk, and sat on the porch among my pots of violets. The house was colder than usual, and I noticed the heater had stopped. I went to the fuse box and saw the breaker had burned. I tried to switch it back on, but one spark was enough and the smell of burning filled the hall. The short circuit started small, but the fire spread in the blink of an eye. It didn't consume the entire apartment, thanks to the neighbors who called the firefighters, but it burned most of the living room, the ceiling lining, and part of the wiring. When I saw my scorched letters, my favorite cushions in ashes, it hurt in a way only someone who has lost a piece of their own story understands. That was my home, my refuge, and now I couldn't stay there. There was no light, no heat, no safety. For the first time in many years, I had to admit I was vulnerable. And that's when I made the decision that cost me the most pride. I grabbed the phone and called Julian. Not because he was my favorite, but because, between him and Camila, he was the only one with a house equipped to shelter me. A big house, with a guest room, electric fireplace, and even a heated pool they hardly ever used. When I called, his wife answered. She said she'd check with Julian and call back in 5 minutes. I waited 20. When the phone rang again, she was direct. Mercedes, unfortunately it won't be possible. The house is full and, well, I don't feel comfortable. She didn't even try to hide it. And Julian? He never showed up. Not even to say he was sorry. I hung up and stood there, phone still in hand, as if it were a joke. You know when you hear something so absurd your brain takes time to register? That's how it was. I didn't cry then. I didn't curse. I just felt something strange in my chest, as if the air had turned to stone. I picked up my purse, shoved some clothes and a few medicines into a grocery bag, and left the building. I didn't even know where to go, but I started walking. That's when I remembered Beatriz, an old friend who lives 4 blocks away. We didn't speak often, but she always said, "You know my door is open, right?" That day, I decided to test if it still was. I arrived pale-faced, hands trembling. Beatriz opened the door wide, as if she'd seen a ghost. When I told her what had happened, she brought me straight inside, no questions asked. She made me tea, grabbed a blanket, and set me on her couch. I think only then could I breathe again. While I listened to the kettle and felt warmth returning slowly to my body, my mind spun. I replayed the phone scene like a scratched record. It wasn't just about not taking me in. It was the disdain. The indifference. The fact that he didn't even have the nerve to speak to me himself. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed curled up, staring at Beatriz's living room ceiling, listening to her old clock tick. So many thoughts came. The times I walked hand in hand with Julian to school. The packed lunches I snuck to him in college, hiding them from his sister to avoid jealousy. And especially the recent Christmases he'd missed, always with some excuse. I swallowed everything. I always thought it was a phase, busyness, work. But that night, with my face on a borrowed cushion, I understood, he had simply chosen to erase me from his life. And that's when I felt something different, anger. Not loud anger that yells and breaks things. A silent anger, almost cold, that made me get up from the couch and go to my bag. I took out a folder I'd carried for years, where I kept my most important documents. Inside was something no one remembered. I hardly thought about it myself. A deed. An old will I drafted with a lawyer friend years ago, when I was still sharp, strong, and full of plans. I kept it as a precaution. But suddenly, it screamed in my hand, now is the time. The will wasn't just any document. It was made when there was still dialogue in the family, when I believed dividing what little I had would keep us united. I'd left everything balanced. Half the apartment to Julian, half to Camila. But in the footnote, almost like a forgotten scribble, lay what now made me breathe steadier, a reversion clause. A line allowing me, in case of abandonment or serious breakdown of ties, to revoke the distribution without the beneficiary's consent. At the time, the lawyer suggested it as a safety measure, and stubborn and practical as ever, I agreed. The next morning, while Beatrice made coffee, I messaged that same lawyer. A discreet man who now did more consulting than litigation. I asked him to come see me, without details. In less than 3 hours, he was there with a new folder under his arm and the attentive eyes of someone who knows there are moments when you don't ask, you just listen. I showed him the will, explained what had happened, and said, I want to change it. He made no fuss. He simply nodded, requested some documents, and said he'd return the next day with the new directives ready to sign. That afternoon, for the first time since the fire, I felt I had control again. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. A way to make clear that my silence didn't mean forgetfulness, nor weakness. I spent hours in Beatrice's armchair, staring at the fogged window, wondering how a son can turn his back on his own mother without hesitation. And more, how a woman like me, who dedicated her life to her children, reaches 72 having to beg for shelter as if she's a bother. The greatest pain wasn't the fire, it was the abandonment. When the lawyer returned the next day, I reviewed every line. And there, in front of a friend who barely blinked, I signed a new will. The entire value of my apartment, when sold or inherited, would now go solely to Camila. Not because she was perfect, we'd had our distances too. But because she never shut her door on me. Never left me without an answer. And, mainly, because even with her flaws, she never made me feel invisible. Signing that paper didn't hurt. On the contrary, it lifted a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. The lawyer left at dusk, and I sat there with the new will's copy in my hands like a silent trophy. Not for the inheritance itself, which isn't much, but for the decision. For the courage to, after so long quiet, take concrete action. I called Camila the next day. I didn't talk about the document. I only said there'd been a fire and I was staying at Beatrice's for now. She panicked on the phone, apologized for not knowing sooner, and said she'd come get me. That same day. I refused. I said I was fine there. And it was true. For the first time, I really was. She insisted, as she always does, but I stayed calm. I explained I needed a few days to settle things and that we'd talk later. Her tone was different from her brother's. Warmer, more present. Though physically distant, Camila never left me in the dark. She sent messages, called on my birthday, asked about my plants. Not a perfect TV story daughter, but real. Amid all that mess, she was the one who soothed my heart. That's when I realized, sometimes the justice we need isn't to fix the past, it's to prevent it from repeating. On the third day, I got an unexpected call. Julian. His voice was dry, almost rehearsed. He asked if I was okay, if I'd found somewhere to stay. I felt like laughing but held back. I said yes, I was sheltered and well treated. He said he'd heard about the fire and that his wife felt bad about how things were handled. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer help. He just tried to clear his own conscience, like someone who realizes he went too far. I told him not to worry. And I hung up before he could say anything else. I stayed silent afterward. A silence that no longer hurt. It was the silence of someone who understands certain people won't change, no matter how many chances you give. And that the only thing we can change is the space those people occupy inside us. I grabbed a sheet of paper, the kind I used to write letters I never send, and started writing. I wrote to Julian, to my late husband, to myself. Not to forgive, but to record. Each sentence was a little release. And even without sound, that outpour rang louder than any fight I could have had with him. At the end of that week, I returned to the apartment for the first time since the fire. The smoke smell was still there, soaked into walls, burnt curtains, memories. I wore a pharmacy mask, but it couldn't mask the mix of sadness and relief I felt on entering. Sadness at seeing the place I'd lived consumed by an electrical failure and luck, and relief that I was alive, lucid, and finally in control. I walked through the living room calmly, looked at charred pictures, touched soot-blackened frames like ghosts of a life starting to turn into something else. I grabbed some books that had survived, the least damaged, and put them in a box. I saved my letter collection too, the ones I wrote, the ones I received, the ones I never sent. The rest, I left. It was just stuff. And stuff you learn to leave behind when you discover people can be far more destructive than any electric spark. I asked a neighbor to help clear the worst debris and then closed the door, not with sorrow, but with the resolve of someone who knows that phase needed to end. It wasn't just the apartment I was leaving behind. It was the woman who accepted everything quietly. Back at Beatrice's, she noticed my face looked different. "You seem lighter, Mercedes," she said, in that gentle way of observing. Without prying. And it was true. For the first time in ages, I didn't feel burdened by abandonment or frustrated expectations. Strange to say this, but that fire gave me more than it took. It took the illusion. It gave autonomy. It showed me that even at 72, I can chart new paths, cut rotten ties, and relearn to care for myself, without waiting for recognition, without always needing to prove myself. That Sunday, Camila messaged saying she wanted to visit. I agreed. She arrived with a cornmeal cake she always bakes for birthdays and a pack of new socks. We sat in Beatrice's kitchen, drinking coffee and chatting nonsense. She never once mentioned Julian. But I knew she knew. And just by respecting my timing, she said more than any rehearsed speech. When she left, she hugged me tight and said, "You taught me to be a mother. Now let me take care of you a bit too." And I let her. For the first time, without resistance. The following days were calm. I stayed at Beatrice's, helping with small chores, reading rescued books, replying to old letters I'd never dared send. Sometimes, I'd stare at the ceiling, thinking of all I still had. Not assets, nor health. Time. Because, despite my age, I realized there was plenty of time left to choose what I'll tolerate and what I won't accept anymore. It was as if something inside had dug up the courage that had lain forgotten in a drawer for years. One afternoon, while walking in the neighborhood square, I ran into an old neighbor. She was surprised to see me, said she'd heard about the fire, and asked where I was living now. I answered naturally, as if it were nothing. But she looked at me with that disguised pity look people give when they think you've fallen from grace. I didn't get angry. I just thought, how many times have I done that to someone? Judged without knowing the whole story. Maybe Julian is surrounded by such people, who only see appearance, success, status. People who'll never value a simple table with cornmeal cake and a warm blanket from someone who truly cares. That same afternoon, I decided something important. I wouldn't live in the apartment again. Even after repairs, it would carry a memory I didn't want daily. The smoke smell would leave the walls, but not the memory. I talked to the lawyer and we began the sale process. The money would go to Camila, as decided. But I asked that he register a part for her to help me find a new place. A spot just mine, with no burnt history, no piled up past. I wanted to start over. My way. Even at 72. On the way back to Beatrice's, I passed Julian's house. I stood across the street, watching for a few seconds. The living room curtain was open. I saw his silhouette walking by, phone in hand. For an instant, my body stepped involuntarily, as if to approach. But I stopped. It wasn't fear. It was discernment. I understood it wasn't there I should knock. Not anymore. Because there are doors we must learn to leave closed, not out of rancor, but because we deserve to enter places where our presence doesn't need justification. The next morning, the lawyer called confirming the sales proceedings and that a realtor would visit the property the next week. Strange to think that, in a few months, everything I called home would be dismantled, photographed, visited by strangers, sold, and done. But I didn't cry. Perhaps because, deep down, I'd said goodbye to that space long before the fire. When a house ceases to be emotional shelter, it becomes just walls. And walls that don't welcome, sooner or later, collapse, from inside out. Beatrice, following everything with almost sacred patience, offered her place for as long as I wanted. I thanked her, but began looking for a quiet studio with a balcony and morning light to call mine. I didn't want luxury. I wanted peace. And freedom. I discovered that, at 72, it's still possible to restart without fear. And that having a small place, where everything is under your control, can be far more comfortable than living in palaces where you must ask permission to exist. Camila, on hearing my decision, offered to help with the move once I found the right place. That call from Camila was different. For the first time in a long while, we spoke as two mature women, vulnerable but willing to support each other. She asked if I was sure, and I said yes. I didn't want to live where walls remembered pain. She didn't argue. She simply said, "I'm with you, Mom." And that was enough. I realized that, even without grand gestures, my daughter understood exactly what I needed. Support without control. Presence without imposition. Rare. At week's end, I took some smoke-smelling clothes to the laundromat and bought a new folder for the updated documents. I deleted Julian's contact from my phone. Not out of anger, but for sanity. It was hard enough dealing with my feelings. I didn't need a number there as a constant reminder of the wound. No one needs that. Sometimes, caring for your peace means removing certain possibilities, even those bound by blood. And I'd already understood that blood alone isn't enough to keep someone close. A few days later, while sorting old papers, I found a photo of Julian at about 7. His hair was messy, holding a drawing he'd made for Mother's Day. On the back, in crooked child handwriting, it said, "I love you, Mom. I'll always take care of you." That broke me. I didn't cry, but a lump formed in my throat. I stared at that image, trying to understand where that boy went. When did he lose me? Or did I lose him? I put the photo away, carefully, not out of attachment, but out of respect for the woman I'd been, and the son I once had. In the same box, I found a notebook where I jotted down quotes from books that touched me. I flipped a few pages and landed on one that seemed written for that moment. Sometimes you need to lose everything to remember what really matters. I read it 3 times. And for the first time I saw the fire. Not as a tragedy, but as a liberation. It exposed everything I'd ignored for years, abandonment disguised as distance, indifference dressed as respect, the silence that screams louder than any fight. That very day, Beatrice invited me to dine out. She said it was time to celebrate the new cycle. We went to a simple but cozy restaurant, low lights and real food smell. We toasted with grape juice and laughed at silly things like 2 girls. During dinner, she told me something I kept dearly: you still have so much to live, Mercedes. Don't accept crumbs from those who never saw you whole. It hit me like an arrow. Because that was it. For years, I accepted leftovers, of time, attention, affection. And now I wanted the full plate, even if served just for me. When we returned, the sky was clear and full of stars. And for the first time in a long time, I looked up and felt true peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the kind that comes when you choose not to shrink anymore. I felt that. Even at my age, I could walk forward without fear of falling. Because now I knew, if I fell, I'd get up. And it wouldn't be to knock on anyone's door, it would be to open mine, in my new place, with my rules, my dignity, and my silence full of strength. News of the apartment sale spread quickly in the building. Some neighbors asked why, with that curious tone masking judgment. I answered politely, without detail. I felt I owed that to myself, to preserve my story, not to hide, but because not everyone deserves to know what you survived. The realtor scheduled the first visits, and each time someone new entered that charred space, I watched from afar, like a final chapter read softly. It was the end of an era. And I felt no mourning, I felt relief. Camila remained present, texting daily, asking if I'd found any studio I liked. One day, without me asking, she showed up with a printed list full of handwritten notes. She'd visited the places, taken photos, talked to building managers. When she handed me the paper, she said, "I want you to feel safe wherever you live. And happy." It moved me. Because it wasn't about the property. It was about the gesture. The care. Seeing someone where others see only obligation. I took the list, thanked her, and promised to visit them all. At the 3rd option on the list, I found it. A small place with large windows and sunlight hitting the sofa. The kitchen wall was light blue, and the building had a communal garden with wooden benches. Simple, but soulful. The kind of place where I could age lightly. I called Camila right away. "I think this is it." She smiled on the other end and said she'd help with the move. When I hung up, I breathed deep and closed my eyes for a second. It was as if, at last, my body and mind were in the same place. The move happened on a Saturday. Beatrice came, Camila too. Each carried a piece of me in a cardboard box: books, letters, embroidered dishcloths, an old kettle. As we arranged things, I laughed with them, cracked jokes, and realized it had been a long time since I felt like this, included. It wasn't blood that made me belong. It was reciprocity. While assembling the bed, Camila looked around and said, "It feels like home." And I replied, without thinking, "Because now it is." From there on, it was as if I'd been reborn. Whole. After the move, my routine settled naturally. I woke early, as always, brewed coffee, and sat by the window to read. Sometimes I wrote letters I knew I'd never send, just to lighten the heart. Camila visited weekly, and when she couldn't, she called. Beatrice dropped by with homemade sweets and neighborhood gossip. And for the first time in years, I felt good in the silence. Not the silence that hurts, but the one that welcomes. That lets you hear yourself more clearly. One calm morning, I received by mail an envelope in Julian's handwriting. I didn't wait to be ready. I opened it right there. It was a short, formal, cold letter. He said he'd been informed of the will's change, that he respected my decision, and that he regretted any misunderstanding that might have occurred. I reread that phrase 3 times, trying to grasp if he truly believed it was just a misunderstanding. That a mother knocking on her son's door and being rejected could be boiled down to that. I felt more sadness than anger. He still hadn't understood anything. And maybe never would. I didn't reply. I folded the letter and stored it in the same folder as the new will. Not out of attachment, but because all of it is part of my story now. And we don't need to tear up what we lived, just reorganize. Know where to store it so we don't trip over it again. That's when I realized I didn't need reconciliation to have peace. Forgiveness, sometimes, is just stopping to insist where there's no return. It isn't forgetting what they did to you, but but remembering in a way that doesn't hurt anymore. And that, for me, was liberation enough. Slowly, I began rediscovering myself. I wrote short chronicles again, started walking in the square, even joined a book club. It was curious seeing myself in this new phase, still with the same wrinkled hands, but with a different steadiness. I met women my age with stories as hard as mine. And for the first time, I told mine out loud, in a coffee circle. I spoke without crying. They listened without interrupting. And at the end, one of them held my hand and said, "You turned the page. And look how beautiful this new one is." I smiled. Because it was true. As months passed, I noticed the loneliness that once accompanied me no longer had the same weight. It was still there sometimes, but not the shadow that made me doubt myself. It was more like an old acquaintance visiting but no longer ruling. The new apartment gained my scents, my plants, my stories. One day, Camila said the place felt like an extension of me. And I knew then I'd made the right restart. Sometimes what we need isn't more time, it's new. Geography. There was a specific day that marked me. I was leaving the market with 2 small bags and saw Julian across the street. He saw me too. For a few seconds, our eyes met. He hesitated, as if to cross, but didn't. I simply nodded and kept walking. There was no anger, no rush. Just certainty. Certainty that I no longer needed his explanations to go on with my life. Nor his forgiveness, nor reconstruction. Sometimes what we call reconciliation is just another way to keep alive what died long ago. That night, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine Beatrice had given me and wrote another letter. Not to Julian. To myself. I wrote everything I felt, the fear, the hurt, the liberation. And, at the end, a sentence I'd never dared before, I choose myself. I stored the sheet in a small wooden box where I keep important things. Not because I thought someone would read it someday. But because, if I ever forget, I want to reread and remember that it doesn't matter the age, the time, or the past, you can always choose yourself again. The next day, I bought new curtains for the bedroom. A small, almost banal detail. But seeing that light fabric swaying in the morning breeze gave me a sense of beginning unlike anything. I washed the sheets, changed cushion covers, placed a fresh flower on the kitchen table. All simple. All mine. For the first time since the fire, I felt the house mirrored exactly who I'd become, light, quiet, yet full of life. One Saturday afternoon, I got a visit from one of the grandkids. Matthias, Julian's eldest. He knocked alone, holding a box of empanadas and looking a bit awkward. He said he wanted to see me, that he missed me, and asked if he could come in. I hesitated for a second but opened the door. He wasn't to blame for anything. We sat in the kitchen and talked about school, football, the plants blooming on the balcony. We never mentioned his father. And that was better. It was like, for a moment, time went back to before everything broke. When Matthias left, he hugged me tight. "We miss you, Abuela," he said. That moved me. I knew the kids, even growing up in an environment where absence became routine, still had affection. And that was enough. I didn't want to use the grandkids as a bridge, nor as emotional leverage. But knowing they remembered me warmly warmed me inside. I closed the door after he left and pressed my forehead against the wood. I didn't cry. I just thanked, in silence, for there still being traces of love. Where I thought nothing would remain. A few weeks later, I received the proceeds from selling the old apartment. Not a fortune, but enough to secure me for many years. I transferred most to Camila's account, as promised. I kept the rest to live with dignity. I felt at peace for doing what I thought fair. Not in anger, not in revenge. But with the clarity that only matured pain brings. It wasn't about dividing assets, it was about recognizing who was there when I needed it most. And that account, life itself had tallied precisely. Over time, my story became less a spoken subject and more a lived lesson. I no longer felt like explaining what happened. Those who knew, knew. Those who didn't need to. I was fine. And that's all that mattered. I started a diary, something I'd never done. In it, I don't talk about the fire, rejection, or will. I write about what I see from the window, the street scents, the flavors I rediscover. Because what sustains me now isn't the past. It's this simple life I finally learned to choose. Recently, I was invited to speak at a local school because of my teaching background. The coordinator was a former student and wanted me to share my journey. I was surprised. I thought they'd forgotten me. But I accepted. On the day, I entered the classroom with my wrinkled hands holding an envelope of old letters, not to read, but to remember who I'd been. I spoke little. I said education is more about listening than content. And that sometimes the most important lessons aren't in books, but in the choices we dare to make when no one's watching. Afterward, a young woman approached and said, "You reminded me of my grandmother. She also had to reinvent herself after being left aside." That touched me deeply. Because I realized what I lived wasn't just mine. It belonged to so many other women who spent life giving everything, expecting so little, and still were left behind. But the difference now is that we talk about it. We write, share, rebuild. And, most importantly, understand it's never too late to reclaim our story. Some Sundays, Camila comes for lunch. She brings fresh produce from the market and helps me cook. We laugh, wash dishes together, listen to old songs. In those simple moments, I feel the real value of what I achieved. It wasn't the new home, nor the justice with Julian. It was the recovered affection, the strengthened bond, the certainty that it's still possible to be happy with the essential. Camila didn't need to promise anything. Just being there was everything. And every bite, every laughter-filled conversation, was a love declaration that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes, I sit on the balcony at sunset, remembering all I lived that winter. The cold in my body. The heat of humiliation. My trembling hand knocking on that door that didn't open. But I don't feel weak recalling it. I feel strong. Because I didn't stay there. Because I had the courage to turn around and leave. And because today, every detail of my routine carries a choice that's mine alone. I built a new life. Not perfect, not grand. But dignified. And that, to me, is victory enough. One morning, while watering my violets, the intercom rang. The porter said there was a delivery. I went down and found a small envelope with no sender. Inside, a note with few words, "Hope you're well. Julian." That's all. No signature, no explanations, no contact. I returned with that paper in hand and stared at it for a long time. I felt no anger, no emotion. Just a strange emptiness. As if the gesture had come too late. As if trying to plant something in a ground I'd already closed for renovation. I put the note in a drawer. Not out of affection. But because everything that comes, good or bad, also composes us. Sometimes keeping is just a way to remind yourself of the path you don't want to repeat. I never responded. I didn't find it necessary. Julian made his choice. And I, mine. People ask if I still hope. For reconciliation. I answer honestly, hope, no. But peace, yes. And that's a lot. I learned you can't force anyone to see the value of a bond. You can only decide how much it's worth to keep trying when the other no longer holds the cord's end. At one book club session, I suggested Camus' The Plague. We discussed isolation, resilience, what remains when everything seems to crumble. I mentioned, briefly, that I'd had my fire, my rupture, my moment of choice. The women listened intently, some silent, others with held tears. One told me afterward, "You went through the fire and came out whole." That touched me. Because that's exactly it. I burned a part of the past so I could walk lighter. These days, I sat to write a long letter. Not to any specific addressee. To me, again. But unlike the first, this one had a tone of celebration. I wrote about how, even being left behind by those I loved most, I found in the depths of abandonment a new kind of strength. A strength that doesn't shout, doesn't show off, but builds. Words like resentment and hurt didn't even appear. Because they're no longer part of me. That letter was like lighting a candle, not to illuminate the past, but to mark the present's light. As days went by, I noticed how everything that once hurt now only taught me. Even Julian's silence, which once gnawed at me, now taught me about limits. I learned there are pains you don't heal by trying to understand, you heal by choosing to stop wounding yourself with them. I didn't become a bitter woman. On the contrary, I feel sweeter, calmer. It's just that now, instead of waiting for others to do right, I choose what's right for me. That changes everything. It doesn't hurt less, but it hurts in a way you can bear and overcome. On a rainy afternoon, Beatrice called asking if I'd join her at the movies. It was some random film, the kind that passes quickly and no one remembers. But I went. We laughed, shared popcorn, whispered about scenes, and left. With wet feet and warm hearts. On the way back, she said, "Mercedes, you're yourself again." I laughed. But later, alone, I thought, maybe she's right. Maybe I'm truly rediscovering myself. Maybe the woman buried for years under layers of guilt and silence is finally breathing again. I also started caring for myself in other ways. I scheduled a routine medical checkup, something I always postponed. I bought new clothes, dyed my hair a lighter shade. Not to please anyone, but because I deserved to look in the mirror and see someone alive. It was as if I were tending to that Mercedes who, years ago, shrank so often trying to fit others' expectations. Now, she was taking space again. And no one would prune that. Not sun, not memory, not fear. Sometimes, in the night's silence, I still think of Julian. Not with anger. But with a kind of saudade that doesn't hurt, just weighs. Saudade of what we could have been. Of what maybe never really was. But I don't let that saudade rule me. I let it pass. Like wind through the window crack, soon gone. Because I learned some absences aren't filled, they're respected. And that love, even when unreturned, can still leave seeds. Only now, I decide where to plant them. This week, Camila brought me a new frame. She said I should choose a photo representing this new phase. I spent a while thinking. There were many, one of me on the balcony, another with her on the couch, one with Beatriz in the square. In the end, I chose a candid shot where I'm laughing, hair messily tied, book on lap. It was spontaneous, no pose. And there I was, light, real, whole. I placed the photo on the living room shelf, between the violets and a scented candle. Whoever comes in will see it. But more importantly, I see it. Every day. Some people think restarting at 72 is late. That it's no longer worth changing, breaking, reorganizing. But I say with every certainty in my heart, it's never too late to choose peace. Never too late to leave where you're unwelcome. Never too late to lock the door, this time from the inside. I didn't become someone else. I became the same, just without the fear of disappointing those who already saw me as a burden. And that didn't make me hard. It made me honest with myself. For the first time, I no longer wait to be recognized. I recognize myself. And that's enough. Today, my home smells of cake, sounds of old radio, and has late afternoon light streaming in. I have my letters, my books, my plants. I have Camila and Beatriz. I'm not surrounded by people, but I'm wrapped in love. And that, for me, is enough. Sometimes, people ask if I still harbor resentment. I say no. Resentment binds. And I learn to let go. What I keep now are memories, some sad, others sweet, all in their proper place on my inner shelf. Nothing scattered, nothing hidden. Everything where it belongs. I don't know how much time I have left. But I know these last months have been the most mine I've ever lived. Because I chose every step. Every silence, every gesture. I wasn't pushed. I was decided. I didn't take what was left. I claimed what was my right, dignity, self-love, and a life that, though simple, is whole. If someone asks what I learned, I'll answer without hesitation. Sometimes, to find yourself again, you must lose everything, and have the courage to restart from within. Not long ago, I saw Julian again. I was in a restaurant, he walked by with his family. He saw me, hesitated, and for a moment I thought he'd come. But he didn't. And that's okay. I didn't wait. It didn't hurt. I just kept eating my soup, listening to the background music, feeling the sun's warmth through the glass. That was liberating. Because I realized I no longer needed that recognition I'd silently begged for. He saw me. But I no longer needed to be seen by him to exist. I returned home calmly, thinking how life is made of these small milestones. It's not the big gestures that change everything, it's the moments when we choose to move on without looking back. I arrived, took off my shoes, played soft music, and sat on the balcony. I opened the diary and wrote only one sentence: now I'm the one who closes the door. And that's it. Not with rancor, not with revenge. But with firmness. With self-love. With the serenity of someone who no longer needs to explain herself. A few days later, Camila told me she was considering going back to school. She said my story inspired her to leave the place where she felt stuck. I smiled. I realized that when we choose to live truthfully, it spreads. It's not just our life that changes. It's how others see possibilities too. Seeing my daughter find courage in my steps was the kind of reward no one can give. It was an invisible legacy, but profound. Today, I live lightly. Not because nothing hurts anymore, but because I chose to carry only what strengthens me. And that's enough. I no longer write letters waiting for answers. I write to record. I lived. I survived. And I changed. Without shouting, without demanding. Sometimes, the loudest noise we can make is to stop begging and simply move on. If I had to say something to anyone who's lived what I lived, it would be this: don't fear leaving where you're unwanted. Sometimes, the only way to be heard is to stop knocking. And, above all, never underestimate the power of a silent woman when she decides to stop swallowing everything quietly. Because in the end, I didn't knock on that door again. But when I shut my own, it flung open an entire world just for me. The last thing I put away that day was a small wooden sign I found at a craft fair. It read, "Here lives a woman who learned to choose herself." I hung it right at my new home's entrance. Not to show others, but to remind myself. Every time I walk in and see that phrase, I feel I've come back to me. That everything that burned, everything that hurt, brought me here. And that, even with scars, I'm more whole now than I've ever been. I know not everyone will understand the choices I made. But I learned I no longer need to be understood, I need to be true to what makes me well. And today, what makes me well is this piece I built brick by brick, gesture by gesture, silence by silence. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I won't live waiting for recognition from those who don't see me. Because now I see myself. And that's enough. If you made it this far, thank you for staying until the end. Sometimes life forces us to restart when everything seems lost, and even without wanting to, we discover strengths we never knew we had. Maybe you've also knocked on a door that didn't open, or maybe you're gathering courage now to lock yours from the inside, as I did. If something in this story touched you, tell me. Sometimes, saying it out loud, or writing it below, is the first step to freeing something that's been kept too long. Your experience might echo in someone else's, just as so many stories have echoed in mine. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that there's still time. That dignity has no age, and peace isn't a luxury, it's a right. It may reach the right person at the right moment. And if you'd like to keep hearing stories like this, real, raw, human, stay with us. There's still a lot of life to be told. And maybe, in one of them, you'll find yourself too.